Have you noticed that your mood changes after you ejaculate? Sometimes a sudden tiredness shows up, a sense of calm, or even that slight apathy, as if your energy had simply gone away. That's right, this isn't psychological. It's biological. Semen isn't just a fluid, it's a complex mix of hormones, proteins, neurotransmitters, and chemical signals that communicate directly with your brain. Every time you ejaculate, your body interprets it as a major state change, physical, chemical, and emotional. The brain and the male reproductive system are connected in a much deeper way than you might imagine. During arousal, the brain activates the reward system and begins releasing dopamine, the same neurotransmitter responsible for the feeling of pleasure, focus, and motivation. And that's the big one responsible for changing your mood. Prolactin serves to switch off desire and signal to the body that the cycle is over. But it also has a side effect, a drop in energy, low spirits, and even a slight emotional emptiness. Semen, in turn, is more than a final product of this process, it's a reflection of your hormonal state. When you ejaculate, the body doesn't just lose fluid, but also a small amount of essential substances like zinc, magnesium, and proteins. That doesn't mean you weaken, but it explains why the body needs time to recalibrate. While the brain returns to balance and the body recovers, your mood fluctuates. It's as if the nervous system were saying, "Mission accomplished, time to rest." It's as if the nervous system were saying, "Mission accomplished, time to rest." That's why sex and masturbation, when lived in excess, end up directly affecting your mood. The brain gets used to quick peaks of pleasure followed by sharp drops right afterward. The result is an emotional roller coaster, euphoria, fatigue, apathy, and then the need for stimulus again. But the opposite is also true. When you learn to balance your body and your rhythm, semen becomes a source of mental energy, not exhaustion. The man who understands this connection discovers that mood, libido, and even focus share a common root, the way he handles pleasure. I'm Emily Collins, a urologist, and today I want to show you what happens inside your body and mind when you ejaculate, and why your mood feels this change so intensely. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because here I talk about male sexuality with scientific basis, without taboo, and in language you understand. And tell me in the comments, do you feel different after you ejaculate? Calmer or more drained? Few men understand that semen isn't just a reproductive fluid. It is, in fact, an extension of your hormonal system. Semen production depends directly on testosterone, the hormone that defines not only sexual desire, but also mood, energy, and vitality. What comes out during ejaculation is the result of a complex process that begins in the testicles, passes through the seminal vesicles, and reaches the prostate. Each part of the body contributes specific substances, forming a mixture of enzymes, proteins, minerals, and hormones that, together, reflect a man's overall state of health and balance. When the body is balanced, semen is produced in a healthy way, in adequate volume and quality. But when there's excessive stimulation, stress, or hormonal imbalance, production changes, and that directly affects mood and performance. Testosterone, for example, is used in several processes during sperm production. Ejaculating repeatedly in short intervals can momentarily reduce levels of this hormone, which explains that feeling of tiredness and apathy after a sequence of stimulation. The body needs time to replenish the resources it used. Another important point is that semen acts as a chemical signal between the testicles and the brain. When release occurs, the body interprets it as the end of a cycle. The brain then adjusts production of hormones like prolactin and LH, luteinizing hormone, which regulate testicular activity. It's a two-way communication system. The brain controls the body, but the body also sends messages back. This explains why ejaculation frequency influences not only desire, but also mood, focus, and even the sense of well-being. And there's more, semen is rich in substances that impact the nervous system. It contains small amounts of serotonin, dopamine, and prostaglandins, molecules that, even in low doses, play a regulatory role in emotional balance and the sensation of pleasure. When you ejaculate, there's a brief redistribution of these compounds, and the brain needs to adapt to this new chemical state. In short, semen is an active part of your hormonal balance, not a simple byproduct of pleasure. It carries information and energy. Each ejaculation is a silent conversation between body and mind, and the way you conduct that conversation determines how you feel in the minutes, or days, that follow. And it's precisely at this point that the brain steps in as the protagonist. Because that's where the deepest changes happen, and in the next step, I'll show you what your brain really does during ejaculation, and how it affects your mood immediately. During ejaculation, the male brain experiences one of the most intense neurochemical events the human body can undergo. In a few seconds, there's an explosion of activity in several brain regions, mainly in areas linked to pleasure, emotion, and motor control. It's the entire brain working to turn physical stimulation into an emotional and chemical experience. The pleasure you feel isn't in the penis, it's in the brain. The process starts in the arousal phase. The limbic system, responsible for emotions, activates the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center. Dopamine, the reward neurotransmitter, begins to rise continuously, creating the sensation of desire and focus. The brain becomes completely oriented toward a goal, reaching climax. At this moment, everything outside that context loses importance. That's why, during sex or masturbation, you practically forget the rest of the world. When orgasm happens, dopamine hits its peak, and the body is flooded with a mix of neurotransmitters. Oxytocin is released, generating connection and relaxation. Serotonin appears, promoting a mild sense of euphoria, and soon after, prolactin steps in to close the cycle. This sequence creates a wave of pleasure followed by a sharp drop, and it's exactly this drop that influences your mood. While dopamine brings euphoria, prolactin causes relaxation and, in some cases, a slight emotional emptiness. The brain understands that the reward cycle has been completed and temporarily reduces dopamine release. That explains why many men feel sleepy, calm, or even a bit melancholic right after ejaculating. The nervous system needs a few hours to return to balance and restore its natural level of stimulation. But there's something even more interesting. The brain also activates the parasympathetic system, responsible for the sensation of calm and recovery. It's what slows the heart, relaxes the muscles, and puts the body into a state of deep comfort. It's as if the brain were saying, "Now you can rest." This alternation between stimulation and relaxation is what makes orgasm such a powerful experience. It's the point where pleasure and peace meet. Only this chemical dance has a price. Every peak comes with a drop. And when a man stimulates the brain very frequently, the body doesn't have time to re-establish dopamine, and mood begins to swing. And that's exactly what I am going to explain now: what happens after ejaculation, and why your mood can change completely in the following minutes, even if the pleasure was intense. Right after ejaculation, the body enters a transition state that few people truly understand. In a matter of seconds, what was intensity, focus, and euphoria turns into calm, drowsiness, or even apathy. This sudden change isn't psychological, it's chemical. The brain, which just released one of the biggest hormonal discharges it can produce, needs to rebalance the system. And this rebalancing is what causes the mood swings so typical of the post-orgasm period. During climax, dopamine, the neurotransmitter of pleasure and motivation, reaches very high levels. But as soon as ejaculation happens, the brain releases a generous dose of prolactin, a substance that serves to break the reward system. It's what gives that sense of satiety, but it's also the main driver of tiredness and a dip in spirits. The body interprets this prolactin spike as a sign it's time to rest, recover energy, and reduce sexual stimulation. That's why, right after pleasure, many men feel emotionally emptied, a desire to switch off, or even a slight discouragement. This phase is called the refractory period, an interval in which the body simply can't repeat the arousal cycle. The heart slows, blood pressure drops, body temperature decreases, and the nervous system goes into recovery mode. It's a necessary biological pause. And although it looks like just a moment of relaxation, it directly affects mood because the brain is operating with lower dopamine levels and needs time to restore chemical balance. Additionally, the release of oxytocin and serotonin, which promote connection and well-being, can generate different sensations depending on the context. In a moment of intimacy, they strengthen the bond and create a sense of calm and safety. But in solitary masturbation or with excessive artificial stimuli, the same combination can generate an emotional void, precisely because the brain expected a kind of effective reward that didn't arrive. That's why, after ejaculation, some men feel light and satisfied, while others feel sad, anxious, or irritable. Mood shifts according to the type of stimulus, emotional state, and each person's hormonal balance. What your body is trying to tell you is simple: pleasure needs a pause, and balance is the secret. And that's what I'll show you now: what happens to your mood and your mind when you go a few days without ejaculating, and how that pause completely changes how your brain handles desire. When a man decides to go a few days without ejaculating, something very interesting starts happening in the body, and especially in the brain. The hormonal system enters a process of natural reorganization. Dopamine, which normally rises and falls sharply after orgasm, starts to remain at more stable levels. Testosterone, in turn, is used more efficiently, and the body starts to experience a state of energy and focus that many describe as mental clarity. It's not just sexual control, it's chemical rebalancing. During the first days of retention, the brain is still trying to understand what's going on. It was used to frequent peaks of pleasure and release, and now it needs to adjust its pattern. This transition can generate irritability, mild anxiety, and even a noticeable increase in libido. But as the body adapts, a sense of emotional stability begins to emerge. It's as if the nervous system learned to channel sexual energy into other areas: productivity, concentration, motivation. This happens because, without the abrupt drop in dopamine and the rise in prolactin, the brain remains in a state of light but constant arousal. This accumulated energy isn't just physical, it's mental. The man feels more awake, more creative, and more in control of his own impulses. Dopamine stops being an immediate reward addiction and goes back to functioning as fuel for action. That's why many report improved mood, more drive, and a near-instinctive confidence. Retention, however, isn't about saving semen as if it were a magical energy reserve. It's about giving the body enough time to recover from the pleasure's chemical cycle. When you pause, the brain recalibrates dopaminergic sensitivity, that is, it goes back to finding pleasure in small things, not just in intense stimuli. This reduces emotional fatigue and improves the balance between desire and calm. And there's another detail few notice: during this period, the body improves tissue oxygenation, blood circulation, and sleep. All of this directly influences mood. The man stops living between extremes, euphoria and exhaustion, and starts walking a more stable line of energy and serenity. But just as excessive ejaculation wears you down, prolonged retention can also get out of hand and generate the opposite effect. That's the point I want to address now: when emotional balance is lost and retention starts to harm mood instead of improving it. A man's hormonal and emotional balance is directly linked to how he deals with his own pleasure. Both excessive ejaculation and prolonged retention can produce significant imbalances. The secret is always in the middle. The human body was made to function in cycles of stimulation, release, and recovery. When one of these stages is exaggerated or ignored, the entire system suffers the consequences. When a man ejaculates too frequently, the brain lives in a cycle of highs and lows. Each dopamine surge brings immediate pleasure, but it's followed by a sharp drop that affects mood, focus, and even motivation. The body releases prolactin repeatedly, creating a kind of chemical fatigue. The result is a pattern of emotional instability, periods of euphoria followed by apathy. Pleasure becomes harder to achieve and, over time, the brain starts needing increasingly intense stimuli to feel the same effect. This is what many call dopaminergic exhaustion: pleasure that both addicts and wears you down. On the other hand, holding semen for too long also brings negative effects. The body keeps producing sperm and seminal substances, and if they're not released, they can cause physical and mental tension. Testosterone, when not used, tends to convert into other hormones, and the brain starts interpreting that retention as a blockage. Irritability, insomnia, anxiety, and, paradoxically, a drop in libido appear. Accumulated energy stops being vital and becomes frustration. That's why balance is essential. The male body needs regular cycles to keep the hormonal system in harmony. Ejaculation is a kind of chemical reset, but one that's done consciously, not as an escape. Neither excess brings true pleasure, nor total abstinence brings control. The balanced man is the one who understands his own rhythm, recognizes when the body asks for a pause, and when it needs release. When pleasure is lived consciously, mood stabilizes. Dopamine returns to being fuel, not addiction. Testosterone stays active without being drained. And the brain finds the ideal point between desire and serenity. And that's exactly what I want to show you in this video's conclusion: how semen, the brain, and your mood form a perfect cycle, and why understanding this balance is the first step to mastering your pleasure and your mental energy. After understanding everything that happens with the body, the brain, and semen, it's clear that your mood is a direct reflection of your sexual energy. Semen isn't just a fluid, it's a silent language between body and mind. Each time you ejaculate, the brain interprets that act as the closing of a chemical cycle. It adjusts hormones, shifts dopamine's rhythm, and redefines your emotional state. That's why pleasure can leave you light, calm, and happy, or exhausted, discouraged, and unfocused. It all depends on how you relate to it. A man who lives at the extremes, ejaculating too much or holding for too long, ends up trapped on an emotional roller coaster. What should be pleasure becomes anxiety, and what should be control becomes tension. But when a man understands his own body and learns to live pleasure consciously, balance returns. The brain starts working in his favor, dopamine stabilizes, and mood becomes a reflection of vitality, not deficiency. Semen is energy. It carries biological information, but it also carries intention. The man who wastes that energy without purpose feels drained, while the man who lives it consciously feels renewed. And that difference is what separates fleeting pleasure from true satisfaction. I'm Emily Collins, a urologist, and I see this every day. Men who arrive saying they're tired, irritable, unmotivated, and who, when they learn to respect their cycles, discover that mood and desire are two sides of the same coin. When the body and brain work together, a man stops being a hostage to impulse and becomes the owner of his own energy. Your mood isn't random. It's the direct result of how you take care of your body, your sleep, your hormones, and, above all, your relationship with pleasure. Semen is just the messenger, and balance is the message. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you're part of a group of men who seek to understand the body with consciousness and curiosity. Now, subscribe to the channel, because here I talk about male sexuality with scientific basis and without taboo. Leave a like if this video made you see pleasure differently and comment below. My mood is energy. And for those who stayed until the end, the next video is already on the screen. There I explain how dopamine controls your erection and your pleasure, and why it's the true engine of your libido. Click and keep going with me, because understanding your body is the first step to mastering your mind.